I'm Councillor Mary Wheel, the Chair of the committee, and this meeting is solely to consider the leadership team's response to phase 2 of the Grenfell inquiry. This meeting's been live streamed on YouTube, and so welcome to everybody watching on YouTube and everybody in attendance here tonight. Before we start the meeting, I'd ask all members of the committee to make sure their mobiles and their laptops are on silent or switched off. And as ever, we will start the meeting with 72 seconds of silence to remember those who lost their lives in the Grenfell tragedy. Thank you, Chair. Just a few housekeeping things. We should have an agenda page, but we don't for this meeting. So we'll follow the normal, it's because there's only one paper, so it got omitted. But I received apologies from Councillor Baxter. I should ask everyone if anyone has any interest to declare. Nope. And just to note that everyone should have received, I was asked to circulate and we did an email from Mr. Shah on it. I think everyone should receive that, let me know. And so now we're going to move to our single paper, which is the relates to the phase 2 report, which was published on the 4th of September. We considered the report at our meeting of the 18th of September and presented some observations to the leadership team on the 25th of September. Officers now prepared the draft response to the inquiry, which will go to the leadership team this Wednesday. And we're being asked to scrutinise the draft response as part of that full response, which will be considered on the 27th of November by the full council. Would the leader of the council and the chief executive like to present the paper we've got in front of us? Thank you, Chief. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening. As you said, Grenfell inquiry report was published on the 4th of September. And I think it was a very significant moment for the council, as we've said, and a very significant moment for all the bereaved survivors in the community. Before we start this meeting, going into this report, I just want to remind everyone again that inquiry report made very difficult reading, because it did say that this council hailed its residents, hailed it before the fire, the night of the fire, and in the aftermath of the fire. And I just want to reiterate, I am truly sorry for that. So when we think of our response, one of the main things that we were criticising in the inquiry was not listening to people. So one of the reasons that this response is a draft outline response, so it's not even a draft, it's an outline of a draft, is because we spent an awful lot of time now listening to people in the community. So we've had 3 community sessions, open meetings, 2 with bereavement survivors, 4 drop-ins, to have people coming to council to talk to us and debate at council, come to OSC for a couple of times now, and it'll come back to leadership team, because we want to get it right. We did get it right in the past, but this response is incredibly important. So we really, really welcome your comments tonight. And I think if you just have a look at 4.4, it just tells you that the outline response is in Appendix 1, and you can see it's an outline. 4.5 gives you thematic areas that we're using to sort of plug things together. And each of these is a summary in Appendix 2, which really covers the evidence of the failings found in the inquiry report, the improvements that we've made since 2017, areas that require further improvement, and emerging suggestions for future work. And that's what we were talking to the community and bereavement survivors about last week. And you may say, well, this is all quite late, and well, I don't really apologise for that, because we do need to feel the pulse of the community and bereavement survivors. And you'll see there are lots and lots and lots of comments here. And we need to listen to you too and wrap that all in. And Sam is a scribe, and he'll be able to take on board any of the comments you say. And as I said, we have leadership team where we'll be discussing this on Wednesday. And so it's very helpful for me to be here in person to listen to your comments tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a very clear introduction, and well, it's salutary to remind ourselves of the things that you mentioned, including the council statement. Maxine, did you want to add anything?
Perhaps just to say a couple of things about from the last time that you met us over in Scrutiny, and Elizabeth and I came along. What we brought that time was the implications for the council, which drew out everything that was in the Grenfell Town Inquiry report that criticised the council. And what we've done subsequently is analyse all of that. And there were the key lines of inquiry that were at the kind of the back of that implications report, which at that time the leadership team recommended and full council discussed those questions about how the council had failed, why it had failed, and what the next steps were. All of that learning from the full council debate, from the Open and Scrutiny Committee, from the series of drop-ins that we've held in the community, from the 2 bereavement survivors and the 3 community meetings that we've had, 2 which we've had since this report was drafted. All of those have led to us kind of distilling down in 4.5 those themes about ensuring homes are safe, becoming a better landlord, rebuilding trust, building control and safety standards, emergency preparedness and response, understanding our communities, managing partnerships and contracts, the skilled and professional workforce, listening to residents individually and collectively, and then lastly, but of course not least, governance and oversight. And what we've done today, this is our kind of best efforts of everything that we've heard, and how we've kind of been able to segment that in relation to what we need to say to account for the council and the progress that it's made and the things yet to do, and what we've heard from communities and from councillors. Each section is divided into the kind of what we've done so far, what we've identified that we still need to do, and then suggestions, many of which are things that have come out of community discussions that we've had. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I know the committee will have lots of questions, so I'm going to start with Greg and work my way around.
Thank you, Chair. So I've got one overarching question, 2 points of detail, and one which might be a comment submitted. I think the points I made in the last meeting in the full council, and forgive me for looking at my phone, I'm not very robust where my notes are. About different competency points, I think have been covered more or less in the in your 10 sections. Point I ended with in full council was that organisational culture can only ever be a work in progress. I wonder what your comments are on that and how you intend to ensure a positive resident-focused council going forward, and then I'll move on to the other points when you've had a chance to reflect on that.
Yes, sure. So, I mean, for the workforce, all of the lessons, as you pointed out in the last meeting, are about competency and about culture. And those two things are related, but as I was saying, that competency, you've got to get the competence right. The systems, the training, and the culture is kind of wraps around that. I think not in 2018, we set in place the values that are kind of underpin the workforce, which are about putting communities first, working together, integrity and respect. We intend to kind of come back to those in the light of the inquiry, in the light of the findings. We've done a huge amount of staff engagement as well as community engagement, some of which is reflected in the cover report here for leadership team. I've hosted Casey Lives as staff, which is something open to all staff, and the staff events, staff conferences. We've had team visits, and really importantly, we have had a lot of staff coming to the community meetings. And the point of that is to both to help facilitate the meeting, but actually to hear direct from residents. And that's the thing that we really want to instill in everybody who works here, is that we are here to serve residents and at forefront of that. But back to your question, it's always a work in progress. Yes, it's a work in progress. We've heard plenty from residents that where, you know, examples of where the culture hasn't changed sufficiently. So my job through some of the actions that are set out in this report is to give the workforce both the confidence, the skills and the humility to do the job you need to do in serving residents.
So I won't come back on that point because we'd be here all night if we had a long discussion about that one. But onto the detail, page 26, the first bullet. It struck me when we increased the proportion of residents to whom vulnerability data is known in our social housing. It's a big increase, but 60% strikes me as being still low. I mean, what are your comments on that, and how do we improve from that figure, and how do we maintain it as well?
Yeah, so I think our answer, yeah, thank you, staff heaps. Yeah, so it is a big. We write to all tenants every year, because the other thing is vulnerability, you know, changes. So somebody who wasn't disabled might become disabled, or disabilities might change. So we write to everyone every year. We've also, we do on-site meetings on estates. And we are the visiting team within resident services, try and use every opportunity to identify vulnerable tenants. However, I don't think that peeps number is high enough. So we write to people, but we've only done just over 300 peeps. I know that we have more residents who, would have disabilities who need peeps. So we're going to have a renewed push on trying to get as many residents as possible to identify that they'd like a person-centred prior risk assessment.
And the timeline on that, Maxine, is?
So it was over this next 12 months.
Okay. Moving on to my third question, page 38 is about resilience training, and it refers to, I'm not going to quote individual bits, but it refers to the challenge of ensuring the officers undertake resilience training alongside their regular work. The plan, it says, is too dependent on individual officers' knowledge, and there's some difficulties in calling them out. So I wonder, what are we doing to improve that, and should the requirement on officers be part of their contracts, part of their key performance indicators that they're assessed on every year? What are you doing about that?
Yeah. So, having worked in other authorities, when I came here, I was actually really struck by the focus that this area had here, and the extent to which all directors were trained, saw it as part of their jobs to be part of the senior response. But then, of course, we've got the on the ground response. One of the challenges that we have in this is that I think we are the borough in London that has probably the lowest number of employees who are local residents. It's just less than 10%, and that is often where you draw from your kind of some of your emergency on the ground workforce. We have got a number of really valued members of staff who do live locally and who are on our first responder rota. So that is absolutely fantastic. But where we've had, as it refers to there, where we have had trouble kind of getting people to out quickly enough, it is. So whilst it responds within statutory timeframes, you know, when something happens here, local people don't think it's acceptable if it takes 90 minutes to get to site or 2 hours. So we, in terms of working on that, it's really trying to recruit from people who live, you know, within half an hour's a distance. It's about making it a kind of something that is career enhancing. So to work, and part of our emergency rota exposes you to fantastic experience. The collaboration if something happens is, you know, is really something. It is part of professional development. We haven't yet made it a mandatory part of senior contracts, but actually it's an idea that's come up, and we can certainly look at that and intend to build that into kind of new contracts in the future.
If I may, the inquiry's recommendations were that all staff in local authorities should be trained in their resilience responsibilities, and at the moment I think we do see it as it is seen as almost a voluntary element of public service, and we need to look at whether we make it that change because of that recommendation. Having had conversations with the service as well, they are very keen that some of this is much more professionalised in terms of, again, so it's not seen as merely a voluntary role, but is seen as something that is essentially part of a senior local government officer's responsibilities. But as Maxine says, the sector as a whole has a journey to go on with that, not simply us.
More better council to lead that journey. Indeed, that's their experience. My final point, which maybe as much for the committee as for the leader and chief executive, is that paragraph 4.16 suggests an annual report, and that strikes me as being quite prescriptive with what we're talking about with this report, as this particular one being one off. But it does strike me that each of the 10 theme sections have your areas for improvement and suggestions for further improvement. So perhaps a report next year for us structured around those could be helpful. But that's my sort of initial impression of that. I think you can come back to me if you wish to on that, or just leave it hanging for the committee to think about later.
Why don't you leave it hanging? And, you know, what other what you have to say?
Thank you.
That's me.
Sydney.
Actually, just two very quick points if I may. The first one's on ensuring council homes are safe, and the second one is on resident council and on emergency preparedness. So on page 25, the second, your other improvements since 2017, I think it's the sixth bullet point, service of the new contract for fire entrance door inspection. I have mentioned in a number of committee meetings before fire door safety, which I think is more in the housing. So could you just tell us a little bit about the quality of the improvements that are made within the fire door inspection regime, within the nature of that contract that you have?
Yeah, so I can certainly talk about it a bit here, and it may be that Housing Scrutiny would want to look into it further. I know that it's often reported there. So the contract that we have is with a specialist contractor fully qualified to carry out these door inspections. Each time an inspection of a door happens, there is a full report on that door, and any repairs that need to take place are reported as part of that. And that's one thing, the front entrance doors. Then on the communal fire doors, they are regularly inspected in a day-to-day way by our caretaking staff, all 75 of whom have been fully trained to do that. But that's in addition to the kind of mandatory inspections that those doors have, and that's then part of the overall fire risk assessment and actions and management process, and the assessment in fire safety through the capital programme. And also lifts are inspected monthly now for their operation for fire safety as well. But I think the real focus is that is all overseen. Those contracts are managed by an expert specialist fire safety team that has been recruited since 2017. We didn't have any such thing, and the TMO didn't have any such thing previously. So now we have got a dedicated team of fire safety specialists who run these things. But we do use contractors as well as our own fire safety team, partly because of the volume of work, but partly because actually it's really important to have some external validation of the work that we're doing.
And then my second question is also on the emergency preparedness. I noted on page 37, bullet point, first bullet point, that we've got the new resilience team structure. Normally you see lots of emergency scenario planning and emergency exercises and drills. Could you tell us a bit about how many of those drills you're doing, how many you have in the pipeline, and what that sort of looks like going forward? Because of course you can't be too over prepared for something else happening. So I just want to hear a bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. And exercising is a really key part of it, because it's whenever you exercise you realise where the gaps are. So I'd have to get back to you with the exact number of exercises, because we run different ones for different groups. So the most recent one that I took part in was one around flooding with senior colleagues. That was for kind of silvers and golds, but we've also recently had a really big rest centre exercise at Chelsea Young Town Hall, where everybody who's on the rota as a kind of frontline officer to go to a rest centre in an emergency was attended and trained that way as well. And we've also held multi-agency ones with the fire and the police service. But it is something you have to keep going on. It. It's painting for a fridge, and just last week, there's something called the Magic course, which is the kind of gold standard of emergency planning training, which is multi-agency training for goals. And as one of our directors was on that last week, another colleague is going on the next one that's in January. I've done a version of that, as have other colleagues. So it's both making sure that we're all undertaking those individual trainings, which include exercising as part of the work that you do, and that we exercise as a group as well.
And so, Chairman May, just to follow on, are you doing those sort of exercises at 2 o'clock in the morning when you actually expect to see them, or are you doing it at 3 in the afternoon?
To be honest with you, we do normally do that in the working day, but we have had exercises where we do calls at more antisocial hours to check that people are picking up their phones, got their phone volume turned up, because in the modern day, one of the things people do is turn their phone volumes down. So constantly reminding people, if you're on the rota, you have to have your volume up, your phone near your bed when you're sleeping. But we haven't actually run an exercise at 2 in the morning, although we have, of course, responded to incidents at 2 in the morning.
Yeah, because in Redcliffe we had a gas leak rupture when they were doing a repair, and I called the council about midnight, and a number of residents were actually out on the street and had nowhere to go. We couldn't get hold of anyone in the council. That was at midnight. So in the military, you always have to do an exercise at a time when it's likely to happen, not at midday, because you do them at midday, everyone's always around. So I would ask whether, and I'll report back again when you're next here, have you done any exercises at the time when you might see them happening?
What we did have was a proper incident at 2 a.m. at Empress Gate when we had fire, and I think we had to have, was it 51 people we needed to put up in hotels, and that was very interesting because that wasn't a practice, that was real. And then it was helpful because we could see where the gaps were and how we interacted really with the other emergency services, with the police, with the fire brigade, how we got people into hotels. And I would say it worked pretty smoothly. I mean, we did have lessons to learn, but we did get people into hotels. We did have hacks of phones, because it's little things like, if you come out of your home, you don't have a phone, or if you have a phone, you don't have a charger, or you might need water, or if it's freezing cold and you're in your pajamas, actually you need some clothes to wear the next day. And I think we learned a lot from that, and we were quite reassured by the difference that all this training had made on our emergency resilience teams today.
But on that red clip incident though, the gas leak, if you could give me some details about that, I'd find that really helpful, because you should be able to get hold of emergency officer at midnight.
Thank you. Lucy.
Thank you. Just two questions, as Greg raised my one on the emergency preparedness section. The first was just around ensuring council homes are safe. And the point I wanted to raise, which you don't feature here, which I thought, I don't know if this is something we're doing or not, something that we can feature, is just a kind of commitment to unannounced inspections across all council properties. So they encourage consistent adherence to safety standards, which I'm sure we maybe do anyway, but just I thought, if not, it's not in this, and whether it should be.
Thank you. So the regulator of social housing and the safety regulator both don't know when they're coming, but they will come. They'll come and they will do. It's particularly building safety regulator, who we have to submit plans, building safety plans for properties, and they can inspect us. And my understanding is that they can do that unannounced. I guess doing unannounced inspections on ourselves would be something. We're always looking for that kind of third-party assurance. So, it's a combination of being prepared and also getting people to spot check things. And residents' associations are also really valuable eyes and ears. And so, I want to make something that we do say in here is making sure that safety concerns can always be escalated quickly.
Yeah.
And so when residents raise, if a repair, for example, has got a safety element, or a residents association raises something, for that then to be able to be escalated. But in terms of unannounced inspections, I think our regulator will subject us to that at some point. I know not when.
Thanks. And the other point I was just going to ask about was, in terms of when you're speaking about trauma-informed training, whether that's something that's for frontline staff or all staff, or can that be embedded into the council throughout, as I'm sure would have very positive outcomes.
Yeah. Which bit were you looking at?
I think it's in the rebuilding trust.
Yes, and we it's probably more place anyway.
Yeah, I think it comes up.
So I suppose the thing that I would perhaps highlight on that is the systemic practice training that housing are going through at the moment. So systemic practice training is trauma-informed training that began in children's services, and we have got a kind of centre of excellence that's based here and works across Westminster and Hamilton and Fulham as well in training children's social workers. It is one of the things that we credit, our lower rates of looked after children and retention of social work staff because of the kind of skills they get through that. And we housing staff have often kind of developed their professional skills in much more transactional ways. And that isn't really appropriate here. It's not the way that we want to work with residents. So at the moment, our housing management and our housing needs staff are going through, in the end, going to be a 3-year programme of systemic practice training. And I'm really optimistic that is going to see some changes, some of the cultural changes that residents will see as well.
Thank you, Lucy. Toby.
Thank you, Chair. 2 questions. Well, they fall into 2 categories. The first one is really about methodology and data. So on, let me see, page 15, there are 2 ones to 4. Too long, sorry. So there's an argument the council didn't have sufficient data you have effectively. It needs to be a more rigorous approach, and crucially, it needs to be screening committees and reports of portfolios, which obviously made aware of the data. And I don't know what that looked like. I think it ties in a little bit to the data. I understand it's very early draft of the draft. But there are quite a lot of numbers and measures in this paper that I think are themselves quite vague. So we're talking about resident satisfaction. I don't really know how that's gathered. And there's also when you're talking about improvements, it's things like, well, we've introduced like a PCC, we've introduced this, that, and the other, and that for me doesn't work because I mean I have a lot of experience with TCC. It's not very popular. It's not very effective. So, you know, what is that going to look like in terms of the because I want data. I want to see how everything was arrived at.
Yeah.
And you know, what's that going to look like? My first question.
So this is the comment that the OSC made to the leadership team about the importance of data and how is this reflected really in the report. Just to clarify for my own purposes. I think that's what you meant.
Yes.
Maybe we should think about how we put that in the report. So, you know, whether there's an appendix sort of saying, you know, the start saying, if, for example, the resident satisfaction survey, this is done by X, Y, and Z, and they use, you know, we can have it as a.
It's really sort of who and where and how.
So the tenant satisfaction survey is conducted by the housing services measures, which are defined in statutory indicators and are as an external contractor who provide that data, and we can certainly include that in the report in full. That information is all published by the council on the website, although admittedly not everyone will be keen to read it, I'm sure. More broadly on methodology, there is an issue. There is an issue with data. What the inquiry identified was that we didn't really have a very good understanding of a lot of the metrics and data about our communities and about our fire safety backlog of repairs and things like that. So we are trying to foreground that as a set about record keeping around vulnerable residents, around fire risk assessments and repairs backlog. I would say that the council's overall approach to data can be very chaotic in that it has lots of different sources in different ways recorded in different. Now, I wouldn't say that we're not advocating a kind of more central approach, but we are saying that as a whole organisation, we need a better understanding of all those different sources of data, how they work together and how they can influence and change within the council. I will look into that point on the resident satisfaction right now and see if I can get a better answer for you.
Toby, if I may jump on your bandwagon, Simon, you identified there is a wider issue here. It was me that raised this at the OSC.
Yes.
I don't think that's a very satisfactory response in the sense that there are various types of data, including the ones you identified, knowing enough about our communities. There's also the reliability of the data that we have on our activities, whether we can rely on it, and how we gather data. And I think possibly either here or somewhere else, but potentially here because it was identified in the report. I think we need to take a long, hard look about how we do gather data within the council, how we keep it up to date, what kind of measures we've got to keep it up to date, and our general approach to data. But that would be, do you want to come back, Maxine, and then?
Well, I'm happy to take the same issue, so why don't we take that and then I'll come back on all of that.
The point I was going to make is that yes, we can specify what we want and who we want to produce that data. But from experience, when you, in a particular instance, I instigated a independent audit of a very major set of data, we found that the independent audit came back with a very different answer. So when we're specifying through a contractor or internally and we know that the data we've got actually is the data.
And maybe even a data strategy. I mean, I think I know that's yet another strategy, but it's about ensuring the integrity and the timeliness of our data in a consistent way across the council and holding ourselves to standard. But Toby, I've hijacked your point a bit. So forgive me on that.
So if I might just come back to Toby, we a bit more on the kind of on the overall. So up until a couple of years ago, we weren't producing a corporate set of performance data, which we do now, and it reports to this committee. So we have both the council plan, action plan that reports to this committee, and the corporate performance indicators, which are a combination of kind of borough-wide contextual indicators and indicators which indicate what the council's been doing. Coupled with that, I know that the different scrutiny committees, so lead members at their kind of internal meetings, go through performance data that is relevant to their area. And I know that scrutiny committees as well, for example, in children's, they will take data on education, looks after children, all of those things that we are required, and often things that we are required to report on to central government. So I don't have any doubts that we hold the data that we are statutorily required to do. I think the inquiry pointed out both that that data, it highlighted a number of weaknesses in the way that data was held, one of which was very specifically not having up-to-date information on our tenants, and that is and leaseholders, and that is something that is discussed and dealt with in the response in terms of the we've already talked about it tonight in terms of the way that we hold data on our tenants and vulnerability data. On housing specifically, because of the advent of the regulator of social housing and the new tenancy satisfaction measures, which are a direct result of the housing white paper, which itself was a direct result of Grenfell, those we are required now to independently report on those, and those are publicly reported, and I think I'm right in saying report to Tenants Plus Officer Committee and also to the Housing Committee, and those tenant satisfaction measures covers, I think it's about 60 of them, and they cover a whole load of things from kind of repair satisfaction specifically, but to other things about the environment, the quality of the estate. So, and I know that Doug, the housing director, would be more than happy to kind of share and discuss those in more detail. We do hear, and we've heard at our consultation events, because people, a lot of residents were really sceptical of the TMO presenting data that was positive when that wasn't residents' experience, and that scepticism around data, is understandably is still there. So I think I'm really interested as to what we can do, whether it's inviting people in to sit with the independent organisation that does the data surveys or whatever it is to try and involve residents in making sure that we all collectively have confidence in that data.
Elizabeth.
But it may be helpful for you as an OSC to look into it, because actually each of your individual committees ought to be looking at all these key performance indicators, etc.
And indeed they are. We've asked every single chairman here is holding talks with exec directors and lead members to make sure that we have a sort of suite of data that can really help us to have an operational view as well, and that will be based on, rather than inventing work, it'll be based on what the lead members and also what lead members see as part of their insight. So we're not reinventing the wheel, but it's not something at the moment that we've been able to. It's taken a while to bring it to fruition, but I think Chairman here will agree that we're nearly there. Joanna, did you want to add something?
I want to go back to that difference between perception and what your figures are saying, and I think that keeps coming back to the trust and the reality on the ground. I've sat in TCCs where people are going, I don't recognise those figures that people are having with their repairs, and I think that goes very much to the heart
Yes.
of this change in this culture and what are you giving to us. So I think you really need to go back and sit in a room going, this is what the stats say, this is what it is. Why do you think there's that disconnect? Because I think we have experience on the ground from what residents say to us, and they're just, it's like you're saying, but the figures say we're doing really well. So it's how do we get to the bottom of that?
So, and I think part of that is about learning from complaints, because as you know, we have got, I think we do about 25,000 repairs a year. So even if only 5% of those don't go right, well, that's still a lot of repairs. We've got 7,000 tenant households, another almost 3,000 leaseholder households. Each of those households have got multiple members in them. So it's so I think our tenant satisfaction is currently for last year is 62%. Now that has improved, but obviously it's still not that high, is it? And that's still 38% of people who are not satisfied. And those people often want to tell us about their experience and explain that. And one of the things we've heard very much in community meetings is people feeling like sometimes our complaints are not don't have enough independent oversight or oversight from other parts of the council. That the marking our own homework kind of and we have through our complaints process now, which actually we discussed at I think the last OSC, so you heard a bit about the learning from complaints, but for me that is a key. So there's one thing is the work you might do to just sort of drive broader satisfaction, but actually learning from when things go wrong and having that in a structured way in every single department. So the housing director, for example, has a weekly call over of stage 2 complaints where he personally goes to all the stage 2 complaints with the staff who've been involved in the service which the complaint is about.
Thank you.
On that, Maxine, just from my observation, especially in housing, I think one thing I've come across is everybody has amazingly good intentions. You pick up the phone, oh yes, of course, and I think process is followed, whatever the protocol is. But I find that as time goes on, the end vision is not there and it's all subconscious. I think it's more for cultural change of timing, the timing discipline, the punctuality, the accountability. And then by the time 3 weeks go by and they think, what's happening? Oh, I spoke to somebody else and they're dealing with it. So again, it's one person, I think we mentioned this before, on casework, somebody taking agency and saying, right, this is going to be followed through from A to Z, without, and you have going back to the data, the timing, what's been achieved. And that's quantifiable. So I think following process is not a problem, but it's that long-term vision and punctuality that often falls through the gaps.
Can I say, in response to that, that's what we're hearing from a lot of residents, bereavement survivors. It's this thing about not having punctuality, somebody not phoning you back. And it's all very well for us to have service standards, which we've co-designed, which are great. And if people follow them, they are good, because somebody should be able to say, this is my name, this is my phone number, I will deal with this, call me back. But around the edges, it's still not happening. And I don't think we're alone in that in London. So we say, 62% resident satisfaction survey. It's not great, but it's much better than when we were 7 years ago. And compared to the rest of London, it's not too bad. I think we're in the top third now, something like that.
That's as a landlord. So
as a landlord, but still, you've still got 38% of people who aren't happy. So that's it's trying to get that service up. And what we also heard from a lot of residents was sometimes it's our contractors. So it's actually procurement, holding contractors to account, making sure that the apps work. And I would say on behalf of our residents, I was at Lake West Estate last week before, and they're saying, we're taxpayers, we're paying people to come and do our repairs. So actually, if you're paying your taxes, you deserve a proper service, don't you? So I think we're on the same wavelength.
I'm conscious that I need to return to Toby.
That's
So
okay.
hijacked
That's quite right. And I want
Toby's
just
point,
one-
but it was because it was a good point.
Well, I appreciate that. But one more comment to make on that before moving on, which I will make quickly. One is that 62% that I'm looking at is a sample size of almost 400 residents who responded to the Grenfell Legacy conversation, who said the council hadn't changed or changed for the worse. So that's the other 62%. Just I think that's worth mentioning, and there's you know. And the other thing, just about this general conversation, I think that it's very important to remember that what we actually want, I believe, is to engage more residents. We want residents who wouldn't normally, respond, which is most of them, and as such, being overly focused on essentially hitting targets. People get around. I mean, I think we've all probably had experience of that. If you know a way to hit a target, you're not going to be focused on actually getting more respondents if that's going to affect your numbers. So I just want to have that minuted and just have it in people's minds that that's an important part of addressing the methodology of data. Thank you very much. And actually, Elizabeth, speaking about service stands, but lead quite neatly onto the second question, which is probably going to be less popular, but it's really about budget implications, which is touched on. The word comes up twice. And we're talking about staff training, right? We're talking about culture change. But what we don't have is anything that's specifically addressing the different working conditions of officers over the last 7 years. So that really means, to me, that means numbers of officers, the focus of officers' briefs, right? Becoming broader, and retention, which is also mentioned, but in passing. Now I'm slightly, I'm a crass materialist at the end of the day, and I do look at so my immediately go to, well, why are we being specific about how we're actually going to fund services, have more staff or improve situation for staff, because that's what my experience, my belief is that it's actually harder to be an officer. Certainly on the ground, and especially given I don't think you have effective, like in trouble saying we don't have effective opposition politically, right? So every time there's a budget passed, you don't.
It's very effective.
Yeah, very effective. But so you don't need our votes, right? So there's no council sort of political scrutiny of budgets that's effective. At the end of the day, where the rubber meets the road. So my question is there anything more substantive in terms of how we as a council are looking at those conditions, those difference in conditions for officers, the people who are really, on the coalface, and really an acknowledgement of the difficulties that officers have been facing, given the reduced numbers, combined briefs, etc. And I'll read my question there.
Yeah, so I'll pick that up. So going back to the point about staff training that other people were making, we're only as good as our workforce, aren't we? And the work that people do with the the leadership team that considers this report is also going to consider the medium-term financial strategy, the situation that we're in financially across the general fund, and sets out the savings proposals that you've seen at this committee as well. So it would be wrong to say that we're not in a financially challenged situation. The housing revenue account is a ring-fenced account that can only be spent on our homes and services to our tenants. So there is that kind of protection that goes in there. Housing, I think housing management is the biggest single directorate in the council, and we have over 700 staff that are funded from the housing revenue account and work across those properties. So. And actually, even though our spending on staff, because of the financial challenge. Our staff spending in the general fund has reduced and will through the future proposals reduce further. Actually, our staffing spending in the housing revenue account hasn't reduced, and obviously now those staff who were employed by the TMO are employed by the council on council terms and conditions. So I'm interested, and we've also brought in house things like caretaking who were employed by the private contractor on less good terms and conditions. But I don't want to be complacent, and so I'm interested in and maybe afterwards we talk about the kind of your point about different conditions that staff work under, because obviously people are in different offices. If you're in Lout West, if you're in Malton Road, if you're here, Pembroke Road, Chelsea Hall Town Hall, they're all kind of, or the Balance our office, they're all they are a bit just like different working environments with different experiences. So those staff who are in the more difficult, perhaps frontline roles that are more demanding of officers in terms of relationships, they need to be properly supported.
Thank you. And I'd just like to just say off that, I also think that when you do have, if you do have a department or a team which is reduced in numbers, it does have a broader brief where you used to have, an officer for, South, and now you have one borough wide, etc. Then I think the training actually can have a negative effect. I think it can really wind people up.
Right.
That's my experience as being told by somebody that you can mention on Z. This is that's just a comment, obviously. It's
okay.
Not again, half the time I say these things to be negative. And that's it, I think.
Thank you. So shall we move? Thank you, Kate. Shall we move on to Claire?
Before I begin my comments and questions, just want to follow on from what Toby's been saying there. I think in the report where it speaks about building control, that's a case in point where you have a person who is trying to do continuous jobs because of political decisions around budgets that have been made. And I know that I think also Greg, and you've raised concerns also now around licensing, just as an example, where we are having to make savings, where we are choosing to make those savings in terms of workforce numbers, we are making the working conditions for those remaining staff extremely difficult. That's going to have a knock-on effect on retention and potentially on service delivery of statutory services, which is not good for the council and not good for residents. Just to add that on to what
there's a specific example you've raised of building control.
Building control that's in the inquiry report, but also how that relates to where we are now as a council.
I know that the point that you're making. So, as it says in this report, building control, we have invested in significantly, and the team is much bigger and much better trained with the right systems that they need, both in terms of quality assurance and continuous professional development and case management. So, but you're pointing out that that when the Grenfell refurbishment came through building control, that was not the case, and that absolutely is what the inquiry finds.
And that is some of what they said. So I'm just hoping that we do have learning.
So, and I think every time a staff. So your ideal is we want to run efficient services across the council. Of course, everyone is of that view, and ideal is that where you have to cut. Reduce the cost of a service, that you're doing it because you've got a better way of doing things, you've got more efficient processes or systems to do it, rather than you're just taking out headcount and expecting the people who are left to do more. I know that you've raised that specifically in relation to licensing, and I also know colleagues in licensing have had a look at that instance, and I believe in our budget proposals actually that there is some additional resourcing going back into licensing in reflection of the fact that probably it was over reduced in the past. But overall the budget proposals are, aside from this, perhaps those are issues to be picked up through the
the budget reviews. that
Yeah,
will go on.
and I'd just like to say on the specifics of this report and building control, if you look at page 35, improvements since 2017. Since 2017, the council has implemented fundamental reforms backed by a fourfold increase in funding. So that should assuage some of your
As regards
concerns
building
on
control,
this,
it does,
on
yes.
this page.
But as regards the general point around all our services and how the cutting work sizes does impact on staff and retention and the ability to deliver services in domains other than something life critical perhaps. I'll just go to my questions now if I may. First of all, I'd like to say hats off to the team for producing something so actually comprehensive in such a short space of time, and for distilling so faithfully the input from residents. I think that's it's following the journey that we've been on since the Grenfell Legacy conversations, and it fills me with a lot more confidence that this is can be a genuine consultation and genuine feedback be heard. One aspect within it that isn't sort of explicitly mentioned is the role of ward councillors. So we do hear that we have heard from OS and we have heard from residents at Ward Council, and we've had a debate at Ward Council about the initial stages of this. But I'm not seeing anywhere formally acknowledge the input of the ward councillors.
Oh, well, on page 41, under understanding our communities, other areas for improvement, it does say need to ensure more routine communication and engagement with ward councillors who are the ears and eyes of our community.
Yes, it does, absolutely this. It's not also just about being eyes and ears, it's about having the second largest electoral mandate in the council, second to you, for instance. It's about representing the Grenfell community. It's about the fact that the vast majority of North Kensington ward councillors are also part of that Grenfell community and have input to say as residents. There's an aspect around this which speaks to the overall culture, which I'll come to in a second. But in terms of this particular piece of work, the input from ward councillors, because we have attended briefings, we have attended meetings, and we have been engaged with, and it's a pity that it isn't acknowledged.
Oh, I see what you
Now, I
mean.
don't know whether that is because the team are trying to protect our input from being dismissed, as perhaps some of our input may have been dismissed in the past. And I know that the inquiry report does mention how Judith Blakely, former councillor Blakely, was treated, and some of the outcomes of that sort of culture. So I think around ward councillors and following from what Toby has said about opposition, effective or otherwise, there is an element of the fact that due to the size of the majority, a vote in council, for instance, on the final report will be meaningful. It does mean, in effect, there is a culture of impunity, which has been endured since 1964. And the impact of that on decision making, upon listening to residents is wonderful. Listening to the elected representatives of those residents is also equally wonderful, and it should not be subject to any political considerations or squeamishness, because we're all here, we're all elected by our respective residents to do our respective jobs. And that respective job is made rather difficult because of that power imbalance. And that goes on to pointing out culture change and the feedback from residents that culture needs to change, and particularly among staff. Now, I've been hearing as well, and I would agree with it strongly, it also needs to change within the leadership. That may be a more sensitive or difficult thing to hear, but if you don't change, if you do get that right at the top, then all these other issues that we've been hearing, everything else in that report will follow if the culture at the very top is right. And another point quickly is the importance of acknowledging where it says at Appendix 1, the importance to acknowledge the harms caused. It's really important that, and you can see it in the feedback in Appendix 2, that we also acknowledge the harms caused by the last 7 years. It wasn't just that this was piecemeal, as it says in the report. That's too nice a way to say it. It was brutal. It was devastating to people, and people died. through living through what was in fact an additional layer of trauma. Now I know that that decision, the decision of the exclusion and neglect and abandonment, came from leadership, and officers had to implement it, which must have been very difficult for them. In fact, I know it was. But I think it's really important going forward with the values of truth, justice and change. We need to make sure that we do fully acknowledge what happened in those last 7 years and why. And finally, sorry, Mary, I know I'm taking up a lot of time.
No, you're doing well.
On monitoring and accountability, one suggestion is around having an annual report. It seems a no-brainer to me that to reinstate some form of statutory scrutiny for specifically monitoring this purpose would be a sensible first step. Yes, we hear about the need of external scrutiny, and I agree with that. But given that we have a statutory scrutiny function, given that we've already seen how very well, albeit in time of extreme trauma, how very well the Grenfell Recovery Scrutiny Committee were able to engage the public, which is what we want to do more of, and how effective that was. It would seem ridiculous to not be looking at least considering reinstating some form of statutory scrutiny, specifically around the implementation of these recommendations and the change of the council. And I think I'll leave it there, but I may submit more in writing.
Well, if I could just pick up on that last point myself, because scrutiny falls within my remit. I'm in the process actually of organising a meeting of the scrutiny chairs, obviously including you, to discuss the overall effectiveness of scrutiny and how effective we feel we're being. And we can definitely include Grenfell in that. It's not for the leadership team to recommend how we do the scrutiny.
I wouldn't know.
It's and I hope the leader wouldn't dare, and she's confirmed she wouldn't. It's for us to consider it and to make recommendations to the admin committee, but we will be doing that. It's very hard to find time for a thing, but Jack and I have been discussing it actually, and we hope to have a meeting in January. So if we can, sorry, but there are other points.
Can I come back to you about being more than the eyes and ears of your community? Well, I guess I would say, well, that's why you're the chair of the Housing Scrutiny Committee. That's being much more than your ears and eyes of your community. It's channeling all your experience through, and it's quite unusual if you look across London at different administrations. Most administrations don't have anyone in their position anywhere. If you look at our neighbours, and we're very grateful to have you there, Claire. I think you do a very good job.
If I may come back, sorry, on that one, just quickly. The reason for having a minority chair of a scrutiny committee, and bear in mind there were two, that was done when Grenfell Recovery Scrutiny was, we'll say, abolished, in order to make sure that there was still some balance, speaking to the sort of power imbalance that's been mentioned by Resident Sunshine myself. And when I say whether we are more or less than the eyes and ears of our community, we have an electoral mandate to represent them, whether we actually listen to them or not. We do have a mandate. And in that capacity, as a ward councillor, as a backbench ward councillor of the Grenfell ward, that should in itself, if one does respect democracy, that should mean that the voices of those councillors are respected, listened to and heard, and shouldn't be waved at and passed by on the way to other meetings, as happened the other week. Yeah.
Thank you. I agree. And the other thing I was saying about thinking was what you're saying about this whole monitoring and accountability thing. Well, listening to residents, I think we have to really think about, the engagement we've been doing, about what that looks like. And I don't think we've quite sort of landed on anything yet, because there is a sort of demand for some sort of accountability, or whether it comes to you, or people say maybe it has to be someone external, or whether the government decides they need to see whether all the recommendations are carried out. I think there is something in what Claire says, but whether it's external or internal, or how the mechanism, I'm not sure we've come to any firm conclusions, but maybe Sam and Maxine are further on the path than me.
Well, I think we have a number of different suggestions.
Yeah,
And we absolutely hear the suggestion to have a growth recovery type with similar kind of arrangements to growth recovery scrutiny committee. Also heard representation of people who are worried that might be traumatizing. We've also had suggestions around sort of maybe a kind of independent advisory panel made up of bring survivors, residents, and experts together. Yes, I mean I was including in that. So there are, there are different ones, and as the chair points out, the actually kind of scrutiny arrangements is a matter for overview and scrutiny and for council rather than the leadership team or anything that we write. So the future of that is very much in your hands. I think what we've been trying to kind of take, analyze everything that we've had and think about what would be, an appropriate mechanism to offer kind of assurance and expertise and be part of kind of building closer working together in the future without just adding a layer of bureaucracy. Because another thing we hear very loud from people is want to see actions, not words. So the extent to which wanting to really make sure that resident experience on the ground feels better and feels different, and that it isn't just words on the page. Sam, I don't know if there's anything you want to add on the scrutiny side or.
So in terms of independent challenge and verification, there are probably three things we're moving towards. One is more proactive engagement with those statutory regulation and inspection. So ensuring that we know Ofsted are in as we speak, CQC for adults, but regulated for social housing, the local government ombudsman. Then there's something about using our internal and external audit functions to in a way that commands public confidence, so is directed at issues that are not just internally defined but potentially externally defined. And then there's innovation, new ways of embracing that external oversight. The independent panel, an independent panel is one idea, but also there are lots of ways that many different organisations, not just councils, but the London Fire Brigade, for example, have carried out their own independent review of culture in the fire service following the death of a firefighter. I think it would be wrong to, in 10 days' time, publish a report that says, here's absolutely how we're going to do this, but we can indicate all these different areas and we can set an ambition to do this over a number of months and potentially years. And none of that should take away from the responsibility of the whole organisation to support democratic scrutiny of decision making and service provision, which ultimately the inquiry shows. When the inquiry criticises scrutiny, they're not just criticising the people who sat around the table, they're criticising the organisation for not enabling scrutiny to perform its proper function.
Thank you. May I move on now to Gemma?
Picking up on timelines here, on page 17, you're expressly saying there's no statutory requirement to apply. Therefore, when I look at this report, it sort of feels as if it falls into you haven't given yourself enough time. You've got part of the report here. It's going to go to full council. It's not going to be that much more embellished, probably by the 27th, because you've got to publish it by the 20th. So you kind of go, why have we boxed ourselves into the situation of not giving ourselves a proper timeline? Because the conversations that Claire's talked about, that you've actually gone out to the community, you haven't put them in here, but it's only half-baked. I would have preferred to have done scrutiny on a more thorough basis, with more thorough papers in front of us. It's the classic, we didn't have a week to read this. It's what we talked about in the previous meeting. I appreciate the leadership. you're trying to squeeze it all together into a shorter time frame, as opposed to spend some time, do it properly, put more meat into the report, so that actually we can really read it and really evaluate it and actually give the feedback. I just felt what do you feel about that?
Yeah, actually, before Maxine says anything, I'd just like to say 7 years for the
Indeed.
report to be published. I think we also have to be cognizant of people who are bereaved and survivors and communities that they kind of need a response from us. But anyway, over to you, Maxine.
So it is a balance, and I hear what you're saying, Donna. And so when we set out our timeline on this, we knew that the report was going to be big, the inquiry report, and we knew that there would be an awful lot of work to do. But a big part of that work is telling the story of all of the changes that have been brought about in housing and housing safety, as well as acknowledging the things that haven't been brought about. And I suppose what I would say is that the report that goes to full council on the 27th of November will not be the end of the story. It will be our full response. But as this report points out, the inquiry report itself, and I've just gone through their recommendations again this evening, actually has very few recommendations that are specifically for, it doesn't have any that are specifically for this council. It has very few that are specifically for local government. All the ones that are around resilience, and those are answered here and will be answered. So I think our kind of judgment was, and we may not have got spanners completely right, but the judgment was that it was important to hear from elected members and hear from the community to set out a factual account of progress that we've made. And I would say that the kind of changes since 2017, I'm hoping that those don't look half-baked, because those are a list of actual changes. I think the bit that is we haven't had enough kind of time to debate here is the sort of future suggestions bit. But again, it isn't a kind of guillotine coming down on the 27th of November. And I think some of those, which have got a lot of, which have come up a lot, we've got a lot of support, will probably go from through to full council as things that in that final report. But there will be other ideas and the kinds of things we've discussed tonight that will still be able to follow from that. The other option was kind of delaying it to come out with something more formalised. Well, I'm having been to all of those community meetings. I know that people don't, sometimes people don't like things to be too set in stone. So we will do our final response on the 27th of November, but it'll be our formal response to the inquiry, but it won't be our final response to Grenfell or Grenfell inquiry, because there will be more work to do on that for a long time to come.
So can I add to that as well? If you think about when you're talking about the legacy of Grenfell, to be the best council and to improve things, I think it's been very important to set out, exactly what the inquiry findings were and the improvements that we've made, because otherwise it doesn't give people any hope that anything's changed. Whereas we've been able to say, this is what we've done in emergency and resilience. This is what we've done in housing. This is what we've done in building control. And that's not being complacent or hubristic or saying, and how wonderful we are. We're not saying that. We're just saying we have actually changed a lot. We have heard you and we have changed a lot. And there will be further changes that will need to be made. Of course there will be. As a council, you can never stand still. You've always got to move and continue improving. But what I would say has been incredibly helpful has been all our meetings with bereaved survivors and community and hearing what they've got to say and understanding that the constant challenges that we face and that we need to up our game. Really.
I'll just come back on Maxine's comments about the future steps.
Yeah.
When are you proposing to set those out in more detail? Is there a formal process, or will it just, how do you communicate that in terms of, because there are quite a lot of asks in here that we are thinking about things, and as you said, some of it will take a year, but how do we communicate that change to the community when we actually are doing these things? Because at the moment they're reading this, and this is a promise to do some things, but we haven't yet worked out the form they're going to do.
So I'll start, and then if some of you want to come in on anything. So the sections that you've got are the kind of, the failings in that particular area, the changes since 2017, the further changes that we've identified that we need to do, and then some further suggestions. So I suppose the only part of all of that isn't kind of firmed up is the further suggestions piece. But all of those other things, because the other thing is these changes don't just, you don't just put them in train and then they just carry on. They are a constant revisiting, as we were talking about specifically earlier in relation to fire safety, and workforce. Is a constant kind of attention to detail, investment in systems and training. And a lot of the response, that's what it sets out, as well as the kind of, we need to do more, like the discussion we had about data, we need to do more on making sure that we've got consistent data sets that speak to each other. So it is the suggestions area, and it's just how we're going to set that out in the final draft report. I'm just going to ask Sam to come in on that.
Well, I suppose the first thing to say is that we're doing something quite novel, which is trying to convene a response on behalf of an institution. It's not the leadership team's response. It's aimed to be the council's response, and the council taking responsibility and ownership as a whole. So, and we're also doing it in having the conversation in public. The first report was published within a week, with about 10 days after the full phase 2 response was published. We've had those community meetings. These documents have been the basis on which those conversations have taken place. And we're having a conversation with you over in Scrutiny and with leadership team on Wednesday. And then, led by Maxine, we'll be drawing those together into the final response. I would hope, and I am ambitious, that it will be a more developed response that comes out in 10 days' time. And we haven't 7 years, but also we've been preparing for this for about a year. In my other hat, we spend a year round preparing for elections and then deliver it within 6 weeks. So I'm confident that we can deliver this, and it will command confidence of this committee and the council as a whole. In terms of turning the suggestions into actions, we're aiming to have a number of specific commitments that the council can make, and the majority of those will be on behalf of the leadership team because there will be executive functions that need to implement them. They'll be sorted under those 10 categories that those thematic areas we've set out in this structure. Most of them will be contained here, but we've heard from the community and from services and from others about what they would see as the most important and the most effective of those measures. We think there may also be some areas of some more cross-cutting projects that we'll aim to put in place around monitoring and accountability, around culture change, and around examining issues of discrimination and inequality as well. I would be very happy to circulate the draft when it is to this committee before it goes to full council. But at the end of the day, a response agreed by Maxine will be brought to the council for adoption, and the council can debate it and see where it lands.
Just 2 specific questions. We go to section 5E, so page 33. This is the rebuilding trust. For me, when I read this, I found myself going, what are we saying in a language that everybody can understand? And I felt we should go back to actually look at using plain English. And my other just comment on this page, and I know it's also been raised earlier, is the commitment, for example, in the third. So yes, for example, residents consider a more systematic approach to the way staff work. I looked at that and I went, that needs to include contractors and subcontractors. I will leave my other questions. I genuinely think this should be in simpler English.
Yeah, I agree entirely.
I think you're completely right.
Thank you. John, a few comments? May I pass on to Will, please?
Thank you, Chair. I want to say first that I think there's a lot in this, and this is obviously a fundamentally important subject area for the council. Just bears restating that. I support what Joanna said with regard to time frame, because I think that even if you don't put any new information into this report, it needs to be thoroughly rewritten so that it's more digestible and understandable and clear in its message. I think it underachieves in relation to what it's already got in it. That makes sense to say. And for instance, some of the relationship in lines of inquiry and then the appendice areas. And the structure is very clear, but it doesn't quite yet happen. And that's probably as much an editorial thing as it is a structural thing. But that means somebody needs to think of this from a structural point of view, review that, and are the bits joining up. And then there's a lot of plain English work to be done. I'll pick out one example on page 15. I think it's the 8th bullet point down. The need for the council's response to address concerns about racial and social discrimination. Actually, right that that should be in there. It does reflect the lines of the inquiry. Then it goes on to say, including racism and Islamophobia. Now, of course, it would include racism, but actually saying having a response to concerns about racial discrimination, including racism, is a complete nonsense in terms of English. Now, it's a frustration with some of the detail, and that is a detail, but it's that lack of editorial consistency, because that's a result of a cut and paste somewhere that's gone wrong. And it's the lack of resolving those things or bring it. I mean, when I read this about 4 or 5 times, and I kept tripping up on these little details. But moving on to something more positive, I think that the section 5D, pages 34 and 36, is more resolved and clear. Maybe because it's more in a technical area, it's been written by somebody who understands the process of that, and it's easier to do than some of the more cultural related issues. So there are elements of this report that are really in a form that are digestible. The area that I really wanted to focus on in terms of question though is to do with scrutiny, because in several places in the report, and in the inquiry report as well, it calls for better scrutiny, seeks better scrutiny. Now, having been involved in scrutiny in various roles over many years, the role of scrutiny has been redefined with help from outside, from the Centre for Scrutiny and other agencies and so on. But if we're going to improve it, we have, I think, to seek to define what its role is. I think a general statement, a restatement of its role between the executive, the leadership, and so on, would be useful. And then in the context of that, maybe a question posed as to how far. Is it conceivably possible? I mean, in the inquiry report, I remember I was quoted as quoted about my it's actually an inquiry document. I was quoted on one hand of being very persistent about things, and then being lied to, and then not pursuing things enough. I mean, there was a bit of a contradiction there. I do happen to be technically qualified to a degree, but that's not the point. The role of scrutiny is lay people coming into this juncture and being asked to second guess Maxine and her 2,000 staff. And the support that we get is largely from those staff in terms of giving us technical information. So it's very difficult to think about how you audit that, how you define the role, how you resource it, and that's not just money or even the excellent support people we have in Scrutiny, but it's the intellectual knowledge of things. It's the power to have access to information in the timely form. And I think what John and I are going to say is that we had a more developed report a month ago, had a chance to digest it, we could have done better scrutiny. It's putting some sense of definition into the process of what scrutiny is about, and what how it relates to the roles of the other two parts of the council, and also to our external bodies, a relationship with contractors, but also our relationship with London government, central government, regulatory structures, the law, NHS, and those sort of things.
Maxine, do you want to respond to that? Or?
Yes, so thank you for that. And I think that, so the inquiry report uses scrutiny in different ways, doesn't it? So it uses it in the way that the English language reads it, which is to scrutinise a topic, but it moves between the function of the scrutiny, the Housing and Property Scrutiny Committee at the time, and pre-2017, through to kind of the scrutiny role that the organisation should have played. And actually, it doesn't spend a huge amount of time really discussing the role of council and council officers. So we would just to step away for a moment, what you should expect from council officers is to manage contractors appropriately and with the appropriate levels of skill, and you should expect us to resource a clienting function such that those contractors can be cliented. And when Grenfell happened, the clienting resource for the whole TMO was, I think, 2 council officers internally, who were dedicated to it with a bit of additional resource, and that in itself was insufficient. So I made that point just to say that the when we talked about scrutiny, about external scrutiny, the role of committees, and the inquiry's findings, as an organisation, we need to look at what does the officer base of the council need to do in order to enable effective scrutiny. And what the inquiry finds is that the information that the scrutiny committees were being given wasn't being properly analysed and audited by the TMO board. That is actually not mentioned much in the inquiry, either by the TMO board or by the TMO processes themselves, or by council officers who were clienting the TMO. So as we said earlier, I think that there's some discussions we had, isn't there, about the role of scrutiny in looking at these recommendations in the future. But in respect of scrutiny committees, I think that there is the scrutiny committee can only scrutinise and is one part of the overall process of scrutiny. Just picking up your drafting point there, I think we completely accept that as Joan's point as well, is that you need to look through and plain English. Yeah. But the reference to but just to explain that point on page 15, the inquiry references social and racial discrimination in the aftermath. And then what we've heard from community meetings is concerns about and references to racism and Islamophobia. So that's so that actually isn't sloppy drafting. It is trying to make that distinction, but I appreciate it doesn't come across. So we need to look at it anyway. But that's that's the distinction.
Okay. And also I didn't mean to criticise those who have been involved in the drafting, but I think this has been a Herculean task. But one final thing I wanted to say is that I support the idea of there being continuous improvement and annual review. And the question, a supplementary question would be, are we focusing particularly or exclusively on the lessons from Granville for the Granville community in the widest sense, or is it in relation to the whole culture of the whole council? There's some, to give a point, a specific point. If it's fire doors, is it fire doors just in housing, or is it fire doors in all the buildings we have, all buildings that we might influence, like resident associations in places where we place temporary accommodation and all those sorts of things?
So I think I've understood your question correctly. So, but please correct.
Well, one's to do with that annual review,
Yeah.
which is, I think, by the Greg made, and I'm just supporting that point. It's not asking the question. The question is whether the message is whether the focus of this report is entirely to do with Grenfell inquiry report and Grenfell issues, or is it the whole council, its culture in relation to other?
So it's the former, in that we want this to be tightly and factually focused on responding to the inquiry, because that is the purpose of the inquiry response. Having said that, I think the content of that response also relates to some wider programmes of continuous professional development, of systems of training, and of culture change, which are about the whole council. So you're absolutely right, this talks about fire doors in housing, but we need to make sure that we're fully compliant across non-residential buildings as well, which is a different regulatory regime. So this we wanted to keep pretty focused, responding to the.
But I think it might be useful somewhere in a small way just to say that because.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of observations, and page 9.5.1, it talks about the drop-in sessions. I just think it would be better represented if there's a percentage of the representation instead of absolute numbers. It says 2 drop-in sessions. It was attended by 10 people, and the second bullet point, it just says numbers, but out of how many eligible ones. So that would give us a better idea of how it's represented. So that was one. The other one was page 11 again, and it was interesting that the observation was that obviously we spoke about the inadequate procedures. But then it says that trying to get access to senior staff, turnover of staff as well. And then residents were concerned about the repercussions of the complaints, which I found a bit concerning, quite stark. So that if you want to, and actually I will put it in the same point. The constant complaint is working across the council, different groups. It seems there's a very siloed effect, and there's no communication within different departments, and quite often they end up repeating themselves. So that was my and then on page 26, page 26 is a 7th bullet point. It talks about the compliance of leaseholders. And quite often there's difficulty in compliance of leaseholders. And then so how swiftly can you process this? What's the timeline? And the 8th bullet point on page 27 says the same thing with TA landlords. Actually, I just want to know how frequently do we do the checks there? Sorry, those are a few points.
So thank you very much, Ruthie. I'll just go backwards on those safety points. On temporary accommodation, we introduced a kind of fire safety standard and checks on temporary accommodation. It isn't something that's mandatory across London, but it's something that we require of our landlords. but I don't know how often this checks are carried out, so I need to come back to you on that number, because it's a different regime from the regulator of social housing. So the leaseholders, so where obviously leaseholders own their own home, they're obliged to comply with the lease that they have with the council as freeholder and them as leaseholder. But there are sometimes, so particularly fire safety, fire doors is one such, where we're asking them requirement to have a compliant door, but sometimes people don't. It's often because of damage or whatever. Sometimes we can't afford it, although we can talk to them about payment plans if that's it. So there are legal mechanisms we can go through. We would obviously rather, because legal routes are expensive and time consuming and don't leave anyone feeling particularly good about it. So we would always generally try to persuade people. But sometimes actually often you'll find that in more active residents associations is the ones where the leaseholders and the tenants tend to work more together, and so you'll get a higher compliance rate from leaseholders. So just your point about the kind of the few points that you picked up, particularly that one about kind of fear of reprisals really from having made a complaint. It is really concerning to hear that, but it is something that people told us. It was something that I think maybe some people goes a long way back, that they'll feel that they haven't been treated right after some complaint that they've made. And that's one of the areas where I think people are keen to see from us, and that might be through involving residents in complaints reviews or whatever, is that people are looking to see some sort of checks and balance there. So you don't complain to one team and then it's the manager of that team who responds to your complaint, and then it's that team you've got to go to next time as well. And the point about silo working is a work in progress. I think team collaboration has improved, but it's still got quite a long way to go.
Thank you. I just wanted to. I had a couple of points. The report mentions lead members are more visible. I think it would be worth amplifying what that actually means, and whether it's having an effect, whether it's being noticed. I just found whilst echoing Will's point, and whatever the agreement about the timetable, a lot of work has been done in a very short space of time to compile this report. And given the time constraints and the volume of work that's been produced, a bit of jargon can be excused, but it would be lovely if it was removed by the time we got to the next stage. My concern was sort of something really to do with the structure of the report. In the sense that we've got 10 lines of inquiry and 10 themes, and somehow the lines of inquiry get slightly lost in the report, whereas the themes are fairly clear because you've got your A to I, and it's almost as if the lines of inquiry have been forgotten. I know they haven't, but it does slightly feel like that. And then within the thematic areas, we've got clear headings, and then we've got evidence of failings and improvements. That's all very clear. And then we've got two further headings, which are differently described throughout those 10 headings. Sometimes, for example, it's called areas of improvement, the third heading. Sometimes it's called further areas of improvement. And then the next heading is suggestions for further improvement, or sometimes suggestions from further improvement. And so those two last headings are inconsistent in their terminology, but it's also not clear to me what the difference between them is when you look at them. So could they be amalgamated, or is it to do with timelines? If so, say so. What's the difference between them? I think, and I think those four headings could be clearly, perhaps in a rubric beforehand, could be clearly explained. Just because you read it and then you think, hang on, I've just read areas for further improvement, and you begin to think it's repetitive, and perhaps it isn't. So those kind of, and the reason I emphasise that, which seems incredibly petty, is that in order for something like this to be accessible to everybody, the structure needs to be right and needs to be clear and consistent. So that would be my plea on that. And I can see, before I go out to councillors and members of the public in the audience, which is what I plan to do next, I know that Claire wanted to say something else.
Thank you.
Before
I do that. Very quick. Just in terms of financial property and other resources implications on page 17. and human resources implications on page 18. I just had a few points, one of which follows on from what Peter was saying. Concerns are being raised by residents and organisations about both incentives and reprisals, and that's in housing and communities. So that may be a resources implication that could be a piece of work that could come out of this. In terms of possible conflicts of interest among staff, I don't know how sure we are that there aren't any. Are we employing any property developers, hedge fund owners, and so forth, who might be in decision-making roles around property and assets and planning and so forth? And finally, will the culture of the council be able to change if we continue to employ staff who might have been instrumental in the intimidation, disparagement and threatening of residents who raise concerns before Grenfell? And I know that we do. And so I just wanted to make sure that that was considered. And stop there. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. Shall I open up to the floor? Is there anybody, Amanda, did you want to say?
Yeah, thank you. Just a few points, I guess, just beginning by echoing Councillor Gardner's point about this feeling quite rushed, actually, and at the timeframes of reviewing the final response or agreeing final response. The timeframe doesn't allow for sufficient scrutiny of what it is that's being proposed if we're going to have to agree it towards the end of this month. That job might be easier to do when it comes to some of the technical questions around fire safety, building safety and emergency preparedness, but the more kind of qualitative questions around things like culture change, unless there are kind of clear specifics around what that would involve, it will be difficult to be able to kind of make a decision at the full council. So it might be appropriate for some things to be agreed and finalised at that meeting, but there are some areas I think that would do with a bit more thinking, perhaps, especially if the specifics haven't kind of been made available to us. So if, you know, a question around building trust, for instance, commitment to honest investigation and inquiry and inviting external challenge and scrutiny, is that, for instance, a commitment to external scrutiny? And if so, what are the specifics of that? Because I think the issue around external scrutiny does cut across a number of issues, including the one of building trust, because the message that residents have been getting over the last 4 or 5 years or whatever is that the council has changed, and I think it would be useful for them to start hearing that from somebody outside of the council for us to be able to kind of find that assessment is reliable or valid. So yeah, what will that external scrutiny consist of if we're not going to, because actually we talk a lot about the Grenfell Recovery Scrutiny Committee, but I actually don't think that even that's going to be sufficient. And the question of whatever it is that's committed to through this process, it does need to periodically be returned to and reviewed and measured. And it would be really useful to know what that's going to look like. The other issue was around, I guess, so that was the first question, and then the second question was around comprehensive culture change programme. It mentions that it's going to be co-designed with residents and with advice from experts. And again, I just wanted to understand what the remit of those independent experts is going to be, because surely measuring culture, having a kind of mechanisms to systematically identify and respond to issues pertaining to negative culture, that needs to come from outside the council. I don't think any organisation is capable of that level of self-reflection where they're able to kind of measure their own culture, especially if, you know, we know that there are issues with that culture. So again, what will those mechanisms look like? And I'm interested to hear about the London Fire Brigade independent review of culture and how that might be applicable here. There was another point, I don't have it immediately in front of me. It was one in section 5, and it was around. There was a description in the inquiry report about this being a community that was one, and the council, in the response to Grenfell, created divisions and hierarchies. And I didn't see anywhere in the response as to how that's going to be acknowledged, first of all, by the council, because I think that is a big deal that needs to be acknowledged. As equally as important as some of the stuff that came out around racial discrimination and Islamophobia, the fact that this was a community that was united and now isn't because of actions that the council took, how that's going to be acknowledged and responded to, and what might be done to rectify that. And I guess the question of the role of ward councillors, because there's talk about needing to be able to diagnose more robust diagnostic work to understand what's going wrong and what the barriers to good service are. And I've spoken to a couple of people over the past week about what that might look like, but I really do think that the local councillors, not just in Nottingdale, but Golborne, St Helens, all those areas in the north and actually in the south as well, those areas that aren't as well resourced and as well responded to historically as other parts of the borough, those surgeries, those councillors have an enormous amount of experience in what goes wrong and what goes wrong in terms of complaint responses, and that really does need to be tapped into, especially for those councillors who in parts of the borough that don't perhaps come into that type of casework and don't have a kind of a lived experience of what dealing with that kind of adversity that people are facing is actually like, because ultimately those councillors are making decisions and voting on things that are going to impact those areas, having not really had much of a lived experience of what it's like to be there. And that doesn't mean just sort of fly-by visits to RAs or community centres. It's about actually engaging with people on real practical things that they need help with.
I think you've raised 4 distinct points there for some response either tonight or Maxine, do you want to?
I just pick up. It very helpfully wrote to me, to Claire, about this whole thing about councillors understanding the lived experience. I think it's really interesting. You were saying come to your surgery, etc. And I think there is something about training for councillors in different parts of the borough to go to different areas, and in the same way, councillors in the north to understand more about the south. I do think there is something there that we need to think about, and of course, well, for you were talking about the housing things. You sent me something today for which I thank you very much. But quite a lot of that is the same in many wards in the south. We are looking at the same problems, because it's not limited. Problems with repairs, or problems with TA, or problems with accommodation, or problems with children with disabilities and trying to get them into schools, etc. It's not limited to one area. But having said that, I absolutely accept your challenge that we do need to do something about perhaps the training, that somehow we switch people around. And in the meantime, I would say one of the things which we did bring in was this an hour before council meetings, that people can actually talk directly to councillors to say, you know what, you're thinking about this policy, but this is my experience. And I think that has been very helpful. And I would certainly encourage you to get your residents to come, because I think we've all found that extremely helpful. But thank you.
Maxine, is there anything you want to add?
So yeah, just picking up on Mona's point, which thank you, about the kind of the specifics, and thinking about over the coming days before full council. So perhaps to give you an idea of so particularly about external scrutiny, independent scrutiny. So we have heard, and it's in this report, some and tonight, some councillors interested in kind of strengthening both the role of scrutiny and the way that scrutiny is done within the constitution. We've also heard in our consultations about people wanting some type of external scrutiny be that through experts, through residents of bereaved and survivors, and we've also heard a call for, in some areas, a kind of independent review. And so I think what you could expect from a full response is a commitment to taking those things further. So what I don't think people would want us to do would be to say, right, okay, we're committed to some external scrutiny in this format. There'll be 6 members and they'll be selected in this way, and this will be their terms of reference, because people will want to be part of co-designing that. So we could. It's likely that the full response will commit us to some forms of external, to people looking at us and judging our progress, and the exact sort of nature of that will be something that will be further designed with input from bereaved survivors, residents, and elected members.
Thank you. Are there any other contributions from the floor? Sorry, Joanna, can I just check there's no contributions from the floor? I don't think there's anybody else there. No, good, okay, done.
So it was literally on actually page, it's understanding communities and find out. So page 40. And I actually did write down a note about whether there should be drop-in surgeries for officers or indeed with counsellors together, because actually I don't think it's just I think what Mona says, it's not just other counsellors seeing what it's like on the ground. I think actually taking the officers up. And it's not just having the conversation when actually it's mostly counsellors that turn up, but it's taking the officers to the surgery.
I think there is something there. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And actually having so many officers come to the meetings that have taken place over the last 6 weeks has been a really important part of getting doing exactly what you're describing.
Thank you. I'm going to draw this to a close, but some of the questions and comments we've made today have been sort of about seeking assurance about some of the things in the report, and possibly suggesting a little bit of amplification in the report. And some of them have been suggestions about things that maybe should be incorporated. And just to name a few, maybe, I mean, the suggestion there about making some of the emergency training mandatory might be something I'm sure this committee would support if you did decide to train it to that. We've talked about data and possibly having a data strategy. We've talked about the role of ward counsellors and counsellors in general, and getting closer to our community by that. We've talked about the importance of how we feel that the importance of the culture change and leadership and external review. And we've also talked about quite a lot about how we're going to get engagement and scrutiny right in the future. If the committee is all right with it, I'm going to ask Jackie to see if she can prepare, by the time ready for the leadership team, try and condense our recommendations and thoughts about it. But that means me signing it up on my own, probably. Is everybody comfortable with that?
Yes.
Rather than me just speaking on the hoop. So let's resolve to do that. And if there's no other business, I think that's the end of the meeting. But thank you very much, everybody, for attending a long meeting on an important subject.
The email
I mentioned that at the beginning.
you did.
Okay, that's fine. That'll be a nice surprise.
Sorry, Mary.
Yeah.
So,
I thought